World War II was undoubtedly a battle of the sky, given the many countries' dominance in aeronautical technology and their production of powerful fighter aircraft. Most encounters and conflicts unfolded in the sky rather than on the ground. The United States was one of those countries. Even while many noteworthy and effective aircraft were produced, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress, others were regarded as failures. But then there was the Bell P-39 Airacobra, which was the least liked American but the most popular Soviet fighter plane of World War II. This is the narrative of World War II's probably most controversial aircraft. The 1930s was a time of transition, and Art Deco was all the rage. Deco arose during the interwar era when fast industrialization was reshaping society, and the eclectic style of the time undoubtedly impacted the design of the Bell P-39 Airacobra. In an era when some commercial planes could outrun U.S. Army Air Corps fighters, the sleek design of the P-39 stood out against competitors like the Boeing P-26, Northrop A-17, and Seversky P-35. That aircraft was unlike anything in the history of flight. It was a radical departure from the norm in terms of fighter plane design, and its original concepts created quite a mark. It all started in 1937, when Captain Gordon P. Saville of the Air Corps Tactical School and Lieutenant Benjamin S. Kelsey of the U.S. Army Air Corps sent a request for a new fighter plane. They needed a high-altitude interceptor with a single engine that could conduct a tactical mission of interception, attack of hostile aircraft at high altitude. Not only that, but the plane also should have a number of specific features: tricycle landing gear, a liquid-cooled Allison engine with a General Electric turbo supercharger, the ability to carry 1,000 pounds of armaments, and a cannon. It also had to reach a top speed of at least 360 miles per hour and a height of 20,000 feet. New York-based aerospace manufacturer Bell Aircraft answered with its own design called the P-39. Like the Bf-109, the P-39 had a cannon in the nose, but that's where the similarities ended, and the P-39's promised performance never materialized. In its initial incarnation, the turbo-supercharged P-39 could attain speeds of 390 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. However, once the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics imposed its own design alterations, the aircraft's performance significantly degraded. The production P-39 was rendered useless in battle when more weight and the elimination of certain beneficial characteristics were introduced. Removing the turbo supercharger was a huge mistake. Without the turbo, the speed dropped dramatically to 368 miles per hour at 13,600 feet. The turbo supercharger made the P-38 and P-47 excellent high-altitude fighters, while the P-39 failed to reach 25,000 feet and was overkill at 30,000 feet. It was useless over 15,000 feet, so it could only be used on low-altitude missions. Unlike most fighters of the period, this one had the engine mounted at the back, behind the pilot's seat. The engine turned a propeller gearbox in the nose of the plane through a drive shaft stretching about 10 feet. The power plant was deliberately placed behind the ship's center of gravity to improve maneuverability. That's because aviation tactics were still based on World War I flying strategies. But tactics would change considerably in the years to come. The P-38 and F-6F Hellcat, two extremely successful aircraft that couldn't outrun a Zero, were prime examples of this. With the engine located behind the plane's center of gravity, the P-39 was prone to stalling in a tight turn and potentially spinning out of control, killing many pilots. The P-39's limited range was another design flaw, but it was not Bell's doing. At the time, it was assumed that single-engine fighters would act as short-range interceptors, taking off at a moment's notice and returning to a nearby base. The original designation was P-45, but this was reverted back to P-39 before the first 80 production models were ordered by the U.S. Army Air Corps on August 10, 1939. After the French surrender in 1940, the British Purchasing Commission assumed responsibility for the delivery of their initial purchase of 200 planes, which eventually became part of a larger British order of 675 aircraft, the vast majority of which were never delivered to England. At that time, the Royal Air Force needed planes for aerial dogfighting, and while they found the Airacobra fine for low-level operations, this wasn't the type of aerial combat they had in mind for the P-39. The first P-39s sent to England in July 1941 were assigned to the number 601 County of London Squadron, which hoped to replace its aging Hurricanes with a newer and more contemporary fighter. British forces swapped out the 37mm cannon with a 20mm Hispano-Suiza model and the 30 cal machine guns for Browning 303s. But they were greatly disappointed that the P-39's top speed was 30 miles per hour less than expected. The P-39, according to Bell's claims, could fly at altitudes of up to 36 kilometers. In the real world, however, above 15,000 feet, Spitfires, Hurricanes, Bf-109s, and the new Hawker Typhoon flew circles around the P-39. Obviously, the Brits thought they'd been ripped off by the Americans, so they refused to complete the remainder of the order. The 601 was the only British squadron to be equipped with the type, and they flew only 4 missions with P-39s. And then, without a second thought, in March of 1942, the 601 switched to Spitfires, and the British P-39s that were sent to the U.S. Army Air Corps were renamed P-400s. Maybe the P-39 really sucked, or it could just be the conditions. But for the Soviet Union's Red Army, Airacobra was a rather charming aircraft, and there was a good reason why. Bear with us. From the British order, 212 P-39s were sent to the Soviet Union, and this was the beginning of the 4,746 P-39s which were to equip Russian squadrons. This accounted for almost half of all P-39s produced. The Soviets had a high opinion of them because of how effective they were in ground attacks and strafing missions. In fact, they produced 28 aces with at least 15 victories flying P-39 Airacobras. This was especially true on the Eastern Front, where most aerial combats were fought at lower altitudes of roughly 15,000 feet or less, which is why the P-39 and P-63 were extremely effective in Russia. Things were very different in Europe. U.S. fighters were primarily used to protect long-range bombers like the B-17s and B-24s as they bombed targets in Germany from high altitudes. Because U.S. fighters often provided top cover for bomber squadrons at altitudes of 30,000 feet or more, many of the first dogfights took place at these extreme altitudes. However, in Russia, distances were significantly shorter, and unlike the United States and Britain, the Russian Air Force did not engage in high-altitude, long-distance bombing flights. Even though the engine location made maintenance exceedingly difficult, the Russians adored their P-39s. Although replacement components were scarce on the Eastern Front because they had to be sent in from Buffalo, New York, the Russians were able to keep their P-39s in the air by salvaging them from wrecks. With its primary role in defensive operations inside the country, the P-39's limited range was not a concern, mainly because Soviet Union airfields were often located very near the front lines. But the P-39 simply could not fight in this domain, which included most high-altitude aerial engagements, because it lacked a turbo supercharger. But it did rather well in other areas of conflict where it was used for low-level operations, such as the Pacific and North Africa and the Eastern Front in Russia. Americans wanted the finest fighter aircraft and got them, while the Russians made do with what they had and made it work. It was mostly a matter of training for the Russians, and Günter Hall, with 275 victories and the third-best Luftwaffe expert, commented that by 1942, the Russians were becoming much better pilots. In capable hands, the P-39 was a challenge to the Bf-109F and G models. The Airacobra was never in the top tier of aircraft, but that doesn't mean it wasn't good. The P-39 pioneered numerous developments that would be used in the XP-59 Aerocomet, the United States' first jet-powered aircraft.